Exodus 20, verse 17. The journey through the Ten Commandments has been revealing, has it not? The searchlight of each command has been aimed at our heart. At times I would begin a sermon feeling a little bit smug, maybe a bit self-righteous. I'm not a murderer. I'm not an adulterer. Lying isn't my issue, only to be humbled and brought to my knees as a guilty sinner. That's the first function of God's law. It condemns us as guilty sinners. But thank God, the law doesn't leave us wallowing in our sin. There is more than one function of the law. There's a second function. The Apostle Paul says that God's law is a schoolmaster, a tutor that leads us to Christ. At times the commands seem harsh, but in reality, they are the mercy and grace of God. How? See, I would be, if the law only pointed out my sin, if it only pointed out my failure, if the law only insisted, Dave, just try harder, I would be exasperated, I'd be infuriated, I'd be irritated, anything but motivated. I would be defeated. But the commandments do not leave us buried under the load of sin. Rather, the kindness of God in giving us His law brings a desperate sinner to cry out, "What must I do to be saved?" If I face God on Judgment Day, I'm doomed. And then the spotlight is shifted from my sin focus at my heart, and it focuses then on the Savior. The burden of sin that condemned me, listen now, the burden of sin that condemned me, my sin was placed on Jesus. The perfect, sinless Son of God intentionally. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't happenstance. He intentionally went to the cross because of my sin. My sin was placed on Jesus. Jesus bore my sin in His body on the tree. The righteous, Jesus, for the unrighteous, me. Do you see the grace and mercy and kindness embedded in the commandments? Yes, the commandments condemn us, and we should feel the full force of God's wrath coming down on us. Only then will our eyes be lifted up and say, God, help me. Then the commandments are beautiful because they reflect a holy God. They magnify my desperate need for help. And then I cry out for a Savior. If I don't understand God's law and how it condemns, why would I ever cry out for mercy? I would just continue to be deceived by my own self-righteousness. So first, the law condemns us. Second, the law points us to a Savior. And then once we are completely secure in Christ, trusting Christ alone as payment for sins, there's a third function of the law. It shows us how we should live. It answers a question Francis Schaeffer asked, how shall we then live? The law shows us. It shows us how to live in a way that would honor a holy God. It is the farthest thing from following a whole bunch of rules to earn our way to heaven. Aspiring to live God's commandments appreciates a God who saved us. It honors Jesus Christ who paid the debt of sin that we could not pay. Oh, I love these commandments. I love them with all my heart. They are not 10 oppressive rules tucked away in some kind of old dusty book. They reveal my sin, first of all. They lead me to Christ, secondly, and then they show me how to honor Him. This morning we come to the last of these magnificent commands. Exodus 20, verse 17. Follow along as I read. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. If you have an outline this morning, you'll notice the little comic at the beginning. I looked that up because I was listening to C.J. Mahaney preaching his sermon on the 10th commandment, and he came across this comic. He thought it was something that we all could identify with. And he said this: there's only one frame in the comic strip. Just one figure appears. It's obviously Moses. He's holding up the tablet of the 10 Commandments. And after reading the 10th command, he looks up to the Lord and he says, "Oh, I understand. With the coveting part, we can get everybody." It certainly is true. This command gets everybody. But that's not all it does. And we'll talk more about that later. I want you to see three things this morning. First of all, what is coveting? Second, what is the command? What's actually in the command itself? And then third, what's the solution? What's the cure? How can we be helped? For 9 commandments, we have been dealing with externals. We have been addressing what we should or should not do, what we ought not or what we ought to do. But now, as we wrap up the 10 commandments, our attention is turned to an internal desire. Coveting is not an outward action, but an issue of the heart. Coveting is the longing, the craving, the yearning, the appetite, the desiring of the heart. Let's take a look first at what the command is not saying. When we hear about coveting, don't we have a tendency to think something negative? However, that's not necessarily so. A simple definition of the word covet is just to strongly desire something. In the scriptures, covet may be used positively or negatively. For instance, Jesus strongly desired, actually the Greek says he desired with a desire. He really desired to eat the Passover with his disciples. It was something he longed for. He coveted. Paul strongly desired to be released from his earthly suffering and to be with the Lord. Remember that? Philippians 1, he said, "For me to live is Christ, to die is gain." Here was the issue. Paul was perplexed because he knew it would be better to stay with the people at Philippi than to die. But he says in verse 23, chapter 1 of Philippians, I'm hard-pressed between the two choices. My desire, my covet, is to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much more better, remember? It's very much more better that I'm with Christ. See, he desired that, coveted. Psalm 19, verse 10, speaking of the rules of the Lord, perhaps these very commandments that we're studying, the psalmist says, "More to be coveted, more to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold." Sometimes covet is used in a positive way. All that to say, the strong desire of coveting can be positive. However, as we come to the commands, covet is used in a negative way. Many, many, many uses in the Bible are negative, and that's the emphasis of the 10th commandment. The coveting that the Bible forbids focuses on a strong desire in the inner man, but it's a strong desire to possess something that belongs to somebody else, something that is outside of the boundaries that we should observe. It is aching, yearning, desiring that we have something that we have no right to desire. Genesis 3, verse 6 is a perfect example of this, and this is the very first time this word covet is used in the Scriptures. God clearly stated to Adam, all of the trees in the garden could be eaten, but one tree, just one tree and one tree only, was not for consumption. God created the universe, God created Adam and Eve, and God created the Garden of Eden. It all belonged to Him. Except And God said you could eat of all the trees except this one tree. Verse 6 of chapter 3 in Genesis says, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be coveted, to be desired, there's a word, desire to make one wise, she took of the fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. So we should desire, we should covet good things. We should covet that which is righteous. But that which belongs to another, that which is out of bounds, ought not be coveted. And notice, biting into that pomegranate, by the way, it was a pomegranate. As long as people speculate, I'm going to speculate. You can ask me later why I think it's a pomegranate. But biting into that pomegranate didn't cause some kind of a magical curse. Of course, it was a sin to eat of the fruit. God said, don't eat of the fruit. But the original sin happened actually prior to the eating of the fruit. The sin happened in the heart. The sin was desiring, coveting that which was forbidden by God. The real sin was coveting. It was craving and desiring for that which was out of bounds. It was elevating a pomegranate above God. It was actually idolatry. It was saying Adam and Eve knew better than God about this whole thing. And in doing so, they were saying something about God that wasn't true. In other words, it was taking God's name in vain. They lived a lie. They broke covenant with God, which throughout the Old Testament is adultery. They brought death into the world. They blasphemed their Father. They stole that which was prohibited. Perhaps they broke all 10 of the commandments, beginning with a coveting, a desire of their heart. This process is clearly explained in the book of James. James 1 verse 14 says this, but each person is tempted, listen how this goes now, we're tempted as we're lured and enticed by our own coveting, our own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, that's where it starts. The life of sin, see, begins at conception. The life of sin begins at conception. When desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Birth is when the sin of coveting actually can be observed. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Moses went up on Mount Sinai in order to give the people the law of God. Jesus went up on the mount to give the people the law of God. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus dusts off the old original intent of the commandments. You see, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees had muddled it up. They distorted and blurred the original intent. In Matthew 5, verse 21, Jesus said this, you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. See, James agrees with Jesus. The life of sin occurs at conception, in the heart. Coveting is the issue. Something has caused a craving, some kind of inordinate desire. And whatever that is, it has produced anger. And anger, left unchecked, is murderous. But Jesus says the sin is a desire, a coveting that begins in the heart. This crushes the false notion that I'm okay as long as I don't actually take a knife and plunge it into somebody's chest. And that's what the Pharisees were saying. Hey, I haven't technically murdered anybody. But Jesus says, no. Back that up. It starts in the heart, and that's where it's a sin. My offense against a holy God begins with ungodly desires, with coveting of the heart. To make sure we didn't miss a point, Jesus gives us another example as he goes on the Mount. Matthew 5:27, he said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Violation of the second commandment occurs before a physical act has ever taken place. A desire, a coveting for something that you do not have is conceived in the heart within you. Jesus clarifies that coveting is heart adultery and violates the seventh command. Coveting takes all the externals of these 9 commands that we've been talking about for the last 9 weeks and makes them a heart issue. Coveting exposes a sin in my heart that then creates that external transgression. Coveting is the sin from which all outward sins are produced. So that's a bit of a definition of what coveting is. And now we move on to our second point. What's actually in the command? Let's look again at verse 17. Notice how the Spirit of God presents this command. He says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife." And implied, you shall not covet your neighbor's male servant. You shall not covet your neighbor's female servant. You shall not covet your neighbor's ox. You shall not covet your neighbor's donkey. You shall not covet anything that is your neighbor's. This verse begins with, "You shall not covet," followed by, "You shall not covet," implied 5 more times in the verse. It's a strong, forceful prohibition in Hebrew and repeated for emphasis. Do not do this. You must not do this. And what is it that we are not to covet? Well, it begins with our neighbor's house. My initial observation makes me kind of feel like the lawyer. Remember, we went through these parables just recently. The lawyer who tested Jesus in the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the lawyer says, "Well, who is my neighbor?" And ultimately, Pastor Paul talked about this last week in the 9th command, bearing false witness against your neighbor. And Paul says, really, ultimately, our neighbor is anybody. Your neighbor is anyone on this planet. See, the planet is our neighborhood. I loved how Dr. Sproul addressed that issue. The neighborhood is our planet. Your neighbor is mentioned 3 times in this one verse, and it's referred to 4 more times. So we are not to covet some things, anything belonging to our neighbor. That is anyone. It's amazing how we covet just because somebody else has something. I was watching the kids the other day. They'll pick up a dopey toy that's been there for weeks. And as soon as they pick it up, the other kid wants it. I came across the toddler's creed. If I want it, it's mine. If I give it to you and change my mind later, it's mine. If I can take it away from you, it's mine. If I had it a little while ago, it's mine. If it's mine, it will never belong to anyone else, no matter what. If we are building something together, all the pieces are mine. If it looks like mine, it's mine. There could be a rock sitting in the yard for a decade, and as soon as one kid picks it up, everybody wants it. It's so obvious in immature attitudes of self-indulged toddlers, but it's no less ugly in self-indulged adults, is it? He begins with our neighbor's house. That's where I started a minute ago. It's intriguing to me how universal these things are on the list. Have you ever visited the home of somebody? You walk into the home, guys, and then immediately you can sense your wife going, "Oh, I wish I had that. It would be so nice if we could have a house like this." Recently, Sandy and I were at South Lake Tahoe, and we visited this $31 million property. It's no bigger than the land on which we live, except it was $31 million. And on that property, they had one of the most amazing homes I'd ever seen. And yet, you know what they're going to do with that home? They're going to tear it down. You know why? They just built a better one right on the lake. We got to tour the new home. By the way, under the home they tore down is a underground garage. You can drive a whole bus on there, and there's an elevator that takes it down 100 places you could park down there. Seems a bit excessive to me. Yet they're going to tear that house down. We got to go into the new home, and we ate lunch down the way a little bit in an underground house right on the water. It opens up right to the dock where they launch their water vessels. I don't care much for touring houses, but this house tour was stupendous. And yet, I didn't covet one thing on that property. Not one thing. Until I came to the media theater. It was awesome. I sat in the automatic recliner and I felt the vibrations of the sound system, and I thoroughly and completely coveted. Now, as I was writing this, I realized, isn't that interesting? Why would I feel so free to joke about coveting? I wouldn't make light of murder. I wouldn't say the same things about stealing or adultery. But coveting, ha ha ha. Other cultures have dabbled in advertising. Our society has perfected it. We live in a society where the wheels of advertising are greased with coveting. We are so inundated with it. If there were a multi-million-dollar industry in our society intent on getting you to commit murder, we might think that was suspect. Or encouraging you to steal or to perjure yourself, we might debate that. Or to commit adultery, oh, wait a minute, they have those. But coveting is so widespread and accepted, we don't give it any thought. Yet God's word says, do not covet your neighbor's house. Hebrews 13, keep your life free from the love of money. Be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Thank you, Aaron, for bringing our attention to that already. Next on the list is don't covet your neighbor's wife. Don't covet anyone's spouse of any kind. You know, there may be statements like this that maybe have run through your head, or maybe you've heard somebody say them. Well, I wish my husband cherished me like that woman's husband cherishes her. I wish my wife maybe looked like the neighbor lady. I wish my husband took spiritual leadership in our family like such and such. I wish my wife respected me like the neighbor lady respects her husband. Ralph sure works hard at staying in shape for his wife. I wish my husband would do the same. Here's reality. For those who have a strong desire for your neighbor's spouse, the grass is not greener on the other side of the fence. It's greener where you water it. So start becoming the kind of person that you need to be, and stop worrying about your spouse. And next on the list are male and female servants. Don't covet. Perhaps you've heard statements like this. It must be nice to be able to afford a gardener. I'm doing all the work myself. Do you know she has someone come in twice a month to clean from her? Do you know that? I would never think about hiring somebody to clean out the muck in my gutters, meaning I wish I had enough money to hire somebody to clean out the muck in my gutters. Why can't I have a personal shopper and a tutor for my kid? See, coveting makes whiners of us all. And don't forget, these commands were written to whining and complaining Israelites. Certainly, complaining is a sin, but it all comes from a heart that covets, a heart that desires, that which God has not given to us. It is actually challenging God on His providence. God, if you were up to speed on this, you would give me what I want, not what you've provided. Well, you say, at least I've never coveted my neighbor's ox or donkey. In a farming society, an ox would be like a tractor for a farmer. Nothing awakens coveting than Farmer Frank driving down the road in his brand new John Deere tractor with a backhoe. And a donkey would be equivalent to a car. Now, have you ever thought, why does she get a car like that? Why can't I have? And then the verse finishes with, or anything that is your neighbor's. So we said a neighbor can be anyone on the planet, and the final command is not to covet anything that belongs to anyone on the planet. You get the idea? Don't covet anything. Immediately you think, well, I wouldn't have a strong desire for my neighbor's stuff. I wouldn't covet at all if I had more stuff. The problem with that kind of thinking is, it's just not true. It's a dirty, rotten lie. A great example of that is found in 1 Kings 21. King Ahab, you know the name. Ahab ruled over Israel, the 10 tribes in the north Israel. As king, I imagine he possessed just about anything his heart desired. However, there was one vineyard near his palace he did not own. And the king thought that land would be perfect for a vegetable garden. I'm not making this up. It's in the Bible. The guy actually wanted land for a vegetable garden. So Ahab went to the owner of the vineyard, a man named Naboth, and the king requested that he trade Naboth for another piece of land or that he pay a fair market value for the land. But Naboth refused. Real quick, why did he refuse the king? Was he just being stubborn? No. Naboth was actually being faithful to Israel's covenant with God. You can look that up. It's fascinating. But for Naboth to transfer ownership of the land that he was given in the covenant would have been to break covenant with God. So he was being righteous. What I find so fascinating is the reaction of the king who had just about everything that he could want. He stomped his feet all the way back to the palace. He got in bed, turned his face to the wall. Verse 4 says in 1 Kings 21, he says, he was vexed and sullen. He lay down on his bed, turned away his face, and would eat no food. Can't have the veggie garden. I'm going to not eat the rest of my life. Boo-hoo. My neighbor has land that would be perfect for veggies. No veggies. Look, I want that land and I want it now. Jezebel, Ahab's evil wife, seems to do most of the king's thinking. She arranges two worthless men. Worthless is not my word, that's the Bible's word. Two worthless men to break the 9th commandment and to bear false witness against Naboth. Because of the false witness, Naboth was taken outside the city and stoned to death. Ahab coveted, he broke the 10th command. Naboth was lied about, they broke the 9th command, and he was murdered. That breaks the 6th command. All because Ahab, who had pretty near everything, desired one piece of land that he did not have. Well, the king finally got the land, and his life went from bad to worse. Don't ever be fooled into thinking, if I can only get that which I covet, then I will be content. Getting what I covet will make me happy. It will never make you happy. It might give you temporary pleasure, but it will never make you happy. There is just the temporary pleasure followed by a deep and ongoing dissatisfaction. King David's another example. The greatest king in the history of Israel had a flock of wives already. I doubt that any of David's wives lacked in the beauty department. If he wanted another wife, he just went and got another wife, the best available model. But when he sees Bathsheba, he coveted something that was not his. He coveted something that was out of bounds. So, he covets, he commits adultery, he steals, he deceives, he plots murder, he dishonors his parents, he dishonors the whole nation, and he dishonors God. And at the end of the day, it only brought him anguish. He got his temporary pleasure, followed by a lifetime of consequences. Coveting and contentment never walk hand in hand. They never walk together. Coveting never brings happiness. So that's what's in the command. And third, we'll wrap up today by talking about what's the solution. This coveting just comes up in my heart, and I don't know where it comes from, but I just hate it, but it's there. How do I deal with that? Just to clarify the problem, let's go back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve had it made. They had a lot going for them, for sure. But the main thing they had, the greatest treasure of all, was God himself. They had the joy and happiness of unhindered relationship with God. They were made to find their ultimate satisfaction and contentment in God. Each and every day, 24/7, they had unrestricted joy as they walked with their Creator. They were created to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Their hearts were fully gratified as they found total fulfillment in God. Then Eve coveted. She coveted the tree. She took of the fruit. She ate of it, gave it to her husband. What's the big deal? Well, by desiring something other than God, something other than God to satisfy, something other than God to bring contentment, something other than God to bring happiness, Adam and Eve placed a pomegranate in a higher position than God. They broke the first command, you shall have no other gods. And they made that pomegranate a god. They made it an idol. It became a god, little g God for Adam and Eve. Colossians 3:5 says, put to death coveting. Why? Because it is idolatry. That's exactly what coveting does. It desires something other than God. It promotes the created thing above the one who created it. Coveting is a supreme insult that says to God, God, you are not enough for me. I need something else. It demeans the one true God and honors a counterfeit idol. Coveting disgraces Yahweh with even the thought that He is not adequate to bring me joy and contentment, to satisfy my soul. Coveting sniffs around in the sewer while God alone provides contentment. When Adam and Eve coveted, when they desired the tree, they lost it all. They had the cool, fresh river of life, and they settled for a mud puddle. When they coveted, they gained misery, and they lost fulfillment in God alone. The 10th commandment is a strong prohibition against coveting. The comic says, oh, coveting with this one will get everybody. The command gets everybody, doesn't it? But the 10th command is also, it's so much more. It's a directive to the nation of Israel to find their hope in God. Look to God again, and He will bring that contentment. The 10th commandment is a roadmap roadmap back to God, back to true joy, back to contentment of the soul. This is the single solitary solution and the only weapon for fighting coveting. Here it is to find ultimate satisfaction in God alone. You've got to admit, God did an amazing job in getting Israel's attention, didn't he? He provided 10 plagues while they were in Egypt that undeniably showed Yahweh to be the God above all gods. He delivered Israel out of bondage to the most powerful tyrant in the world, and he released a whole nation. He led the new nation to a place where they were helpless. Remember? The Red Sea, no place to go. Egyptians' army behind them. What are we going to do? God, help! And he opens up the Red Sea in a massive show of his power. He led the new nation to a place, Mount Sinai, where he would give them the greatest treasure imaginable. He would give them himself. He would enter into a covenant relation with this nation. God is the only solution, the only cure to the COVID virus. Until the nation of Israel saw God as beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, they would never stop whoring after other gods. They would never stop coveting other stuff. And here's the deal. All that God did for the nation of Israel applies to us, but in an infinitely greater way. Every person here knows the craving and the passionate desire for stuff. We fail to love God fully and love others rightly. We covet the wrong things. We swear we will do better, but we fail and fail and fail again. And then we look into the mirror of God's law and we realize, oh my goodness, I'm a transgressor. I am thoroughly guilty before God. We recognize, like the Israelites before the Red Sea, we have no place to go. I don't know what to do. And we cry out to God, God, help. What must I do to be saved? The law leads me to a place of utter hopelessness, trapped. But then God acted in a miraculous way to provide a way of escape. How, do you say? How did he do it? We see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. In the person of Jesus, God came to earth as a man, but not just any man. From his earthly mother, Mary, Jesus inherited a sin-cursed body that could feel pain and suffering. His father was, of course, God, and Christ inherited a perfect heart that only and ever honored God. He never once sinned. He only did the will of his Father, and he did it perfectly. Jesus never lied, looted, or lusted. He never coveted anything, but he found his total satisfaction throughout his whole earthly ministry and eternity in God and God alone. After Christ fulfilled all the righteous requirements of God's law, people around him hated him because he was doing it right. They hated him so much so that in accordance with the sovereign plan of God, Jesus suffered and died an agonizing death on the cross. Why? Why did he die like that? It's because we have a problem. Hebrews 12:14 says, without holiness, no one will see the Lord. You say, wait a minute. I've looked into God's law. I'm not holy. How could I ever see God? The law convinces me I'm not holy. How could I ever go to heaven when I'm totally guilty before God? Listen to this verse, 2 Corinthians 5:21. For our sake, for the sake of sinners, For our sake, God made Jesus to be sin. Jesus, who knew no sin. Why? Why did he do that? So that in Jesus we might become the righteousness of God. How does that work? When Jesus died on the cross, he took all my sin upon himself. And he transferred to me his righteousness, his holiness. Now, in the eyes of God, I look holy. And then Jesus poured out his wrath on his Son and had my sin. And when you believe that, God has opened your eyes. He has raised you from death to life. He has given you a new heart. A heart that is no longer a slave to coveting. 1 Peter 3:18 says this, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous," that's Jesus, "for the unrighteous," that's me. Why? That he might bring us to God. That's the treasure. The very thing that Adam and Eve lost, the suffering of Jesus accomplishes. This is the cure for coveting. The whole glory of the gospel is in the face of Jesus that brings us to God, where he alone provides satisfaction and contentment. So you have two choices here today. First, waste your life coveting stuff and trying to find contentment in false idols that are just pretenders. Or second, believe that Christ suffered once for all, the righteous one for unrighteous people like us. Why? That he might bring us to God. That's good news. And always focuses on that which will kill coveting in our life. Jesus Christ, who brings us to God. Nothing else will.